The church was a vision of spring. Fragrant roses adorned every pew, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, and whispers of excitement filled the air. Lydia Harper stood in the bridal suite, resplendent in her ivory gown, fingers trembling as she adjusted the veil framing her face. Today was supposed to be her fairy tale. It had been 3 years of love and devotion, every moment building to this day. Lydia had met Matthew Langston at a charity gala, a man with an easy smile and an air of self-assuredness that drew people to him. They'd fallen for each other hard and fast, the kind of love that felt destined. Or so she thought. The knock on the door startled her. It was Emma, her childhood best friend and maid of honor. One look at Emma's ashen face sent Lydia's stomach plummeting. "Lydia," Emma's voice cracked, her hands clutching a folded piece of paper. "It's from Matthew." Lydia snatched the note, her heart racing as her eyes scanned the words. "I'm sorry, I can't do this. I'm not the man you deserve. Please forgive me." The world spun. Her breath caught in her throat, and the weight of those words crashed down on her chest like a boulder. He was gone. Matthew Langston, the man who promised her forever, had left her at the altar. The next few hours were a blur of pitying stares, muffled apologies, and whispers that followed her like a haunting melody. Lydia fled the church, ripping off the suffocating veil and clutching the shredded remains of her dignity. She promised herself she would never let someone like Matthew break her again. Years passed, but the scars remained. Lydia channeled her pain into her career, climbing the ranks from a fledgling attorney to a respected judge. Her meticulous nature and keen intellect earned her accolades, but her emotions remained locked behind an iron wall. By the time she was 35, she had become a force to be reckoned with in the legal world. Yet, behind closed doors, she wondered if the price of her success had been too steep. Trust came sparingly, love was an unwelcome stranger. It was on an unremarkable Wednesday that her past came roaring back. Lydia sat at her bench, scanning the docket for the day's cases. Divorce proceedings. Routine, she thought. Her courtroom was an arena where broken promises were dissected and divided into neat legal terms. Her breath hitched as she read the names on the file. Plaintiff, Lydia Langston. Defendant, Matthew Langston. For a moment, she froze. It had been years since she'd even uttered his name. Her mind conjured images of his boyish smile, the way he used to make her laugh with his terrible impressions, and that awful note he'd left behind. "Judge Harper?" Her clerk's voice snapped her back to reality. "I'm fine," Lydia said, her tone crisp. She smoothed her robe and straightened her shoulders. No one could see the turmoil raging beneath her calm exterior. When the doors opened and the parties entered, Lydia's gaze locked on Matthew. He looked older, his once golden aura dimmed. Gone was the confident man she had fallen for. Instead, he appeared weary, his posture slouched and his eyes downcast. His wife, Julia, was poised and beautiful, with a quiet intensity that suggested she was a fighter. Lydia could see the resentment simmering between them, the kind of bitterness that made divorces messy and brutal. Matthew's eyes flicked up and landed on her. Recognition dawned, followed by something that looked like guilt. For a split second, Lydia thought she saw a flicker of regret. But she refused to let it sway her. She was no longer the woman he had abandoned. "This court is now in session," Lydia announced, her voice steady and commanding. The weight of the past hung in the air like an uninvited guest, but Lydia knew one thing for sure: whatever happened next, she would face it head-on. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of pens on notepads and the occasional shuffling of papers. Lydia Harper sat on her high bench, her face impassive. Yet beneath her composed exterior, memories she had buried long ago were clawing their way to the surface. Matthew Langston had once been her future. Now, he was just another defendant in her courtroom. She gripped her gavel tightly, reminding herself of her duty. Justice demanded impartiality, and Lydia would deliver it, no matter the cost to her heart. "Let's begin," she said, her voice crisp. She motioned to Julia Langston's attorney, a sharp-featured woman in a tailored suit. "Counselor, you may proceed." Julia's attorney wasted no time. "Your Honor, my client is seeking a divorce on grounds of irreconcilable differences. Over the course of their marriage, Mr. Langston has demonstrated a consistent inability to meet his responsibilities as a husband, both emotionally and financially. Additionally, there are allegations of infidelity." "That's a lie." Matthew's voice broke through, his tone sharp. All heads turned toward him, and Lydia raised an eyebrow. "You'll have your turn to speak, Mr. Langston," Lydia said, her words carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. Matthew's shoulders slumped, but not before Lydia caught a glimpse of his old defiance. It was the same fire she had loved and hated years ago. The hearing unfolded methodically. Julia testified about late nights waiting for Matthew to come home, excuses that never quite added up, and the hollow ache of realizing she was always the one fighting to keep them afloat. Matthew, when it was his turn, painted a picture of miscommunication and unrealistic expectations. As Lydia listened, she couldn't help but see fragments of herself in Julia. The desperate hope that things might change. The slow erosion of trust. Lydia clenched her jaw, pushing the memories aside. When Matthew took the stand, his voice was quieter than Lydia remembered. He spoke of his struggles, his failures, and how he had lost himself along the way. His words were polished, almost rehearsed, but there was a rawness that Lydia couldn't ignore. "And I know I failed her," Matthew concluded, his eyes downcast. "But I did love her. I tried to be what she needed, even if I wasn't enough." Lydia felt a flicker of something unexpected, pity. She quickly extinguished it. This wasn't about her past with Matthew. It was about justice for the people in front of her. As the hearing paused for a recess, Lydia retreated to her chambers. She needed air, space, anything to clear her mind. But when she turned, Matthew was there, waiting just outside her door. "Judge Harper," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Can we talk?" Lydia's eyes narrowed. "I don't think that's appropriate, Mr. Langston." "Please," he said, his tone earnest. "Just for a moment. I need to say something." Against her better judgment, Lydia nodded. She led him into her chambers, closing the door behind them. The room was thick with tension. Matthew shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "I didn't know it was you," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "When I saw your name on the docket today, I thought it was some cruel joke." Lydia folded her arms. "The universe has a sense of humor, doesn't it?" Matthew flinched, but he nodded. "I deserve that. I deserve a lot worse." "You do," Lydia said sharply. "But this isn't about us, Matthew. It's about your wife." "Ex-wife, soon enough," he interjected bitterly. Lydia raised a hand to cut him off. "And that's exactly why I'm here, to ensure she gets the justice she deserves. Whatever you're feeling about me or the past doesn't matter." Matthew took a step closer, his eyes searching hers. "I'm not here to talk about her. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Lydia. For everything. For leaving you, for hurting you." His voice broke, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Lydia stared at him, her heart pounding. Part of her had dreamed of this moment, of hearing those words. But now that they were here, they felt hollow. Too little, too late. "Sorry doesn't fix what you broke," she said quietly, her voice firm. "And it doesn't change who I've become because of it. I don't need your apology, Matthew. I need you to focus on the person you're supposed to be fighting for in that courtroom." Matthew nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. "I understand," he said, his voice barely audible. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth, Lydia, I really did love you." She didn't respond. As the door clicked shut behind him, Lydia sank into her chair, her carefully constructed composure cracking. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had lost, and what she had gained. The past had caught up with her, but Lydia vowed it wouldn't define her. Not this time. The next day, the courtroom brimmed with the hum of tension. Lydia Harper took her seat at the bench, her face a mask of neutrality, though the encounter with Matthew lingered in her mind. She had spent the night dissecting his apology, wondering if the sincerity she thought she had seen was real, or just another act. But this wasn't about her. It never had been. The thought grounded her as she banged her gavel to signal the start of the proceedings. Lydia Langston's attorney wasted no time escalating the stakes. "Your Honor," she said, her tone firm and biting, "we have evidence to support the claim that Mr. Langston has been unfaithful. I'd like to call a witness." Matthew stiffened. From her elevated position, Lydia could see his fingers grip the edge of the defendant's table, his jaw tightening. "Proceed," Lydia said, her voice steady. A young woman entered the courtroom, her nervous energy palpable. She was introduced as a former co-worker of Matthew's, and as she took the stand, Julia sat straighter, her gaze fixed on the woman with steely resolve. "Ms. Carver," the attorney began, "can you describe your relationship with the defendant?" The woman hesitated, darting a glance at Matthew before looking down at her hands. "We worked together," she said. "And was that the extent of your relationship?" "No," Ms. Carver admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We were involved, romantically." The air in the courtroom shifted, a collective intake of breath followed by whispers that rippled through the crowd. Lydia raised her gavel. "Order," she said sharply, silencing the room. Julia's face remained impassive, though her grip on the edge of the plaintiff's table betrayed her composure. Matthew, on the other hand, looked like he'd been struck. "When did this relationship begin?" the attorney pressed. "About a year ago," Miss Carver admitted, her voice trembling. "I didn't know he was married at first. When I found out, he said he and his wife were separated." "That's a lie," Matthew burst out, rising to his feet. "Mr. Langston, sit down," Lydia ordered, her tone cold as ice. She waited for him to comply before continuing. "Ms. Carver, you may proceed." Tears brimmed in the woman's eyes. "He said they weren't happy, that they were on the brink of divorce. I believed him. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Julia's attorney rested her case with a triumphant gleam in her eye. "No further questions, Your Honor." Matthew's attorney attempted damage control, but the impact was undeniable. The testimony painted a clear picture of deceit, and the courtroom buzzed with unspoken judgment. As the day wore on, Lydia found herself studying Matthew. He looked small, cornered, and far removed from the confident man who had once swept her off her feet. But she also saw glimpses of sincerity, the flicker of shame, the weight of regret. When the session adjourned for lunch, Matthew approached Lydia again, this time in the hallway. "I didn't lie to her," he said, his voice low and desperate. "Julia and I were practically living separate lives by then. I made mistakes, but I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." Lydia crossed her arms. "Do you think that makes it better? That it somehow absolves you?" Matthew ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. "I don't know what you want me to say, Lydia. I'm not the villain everyone thinks I am." She stared at him, her emotions warring inside her. "This isn't about what I want, Matthew. This is about accountability. Something you've spent your whole life avoiding." His face fell, the weight of her words striking deep. "You're right," he admitted quietly. "But I'm trying to be better. I don't know how." Lydia sighed, suddenly feeling more tired than she had in years. "Then start by telling the truth. To her. To yourself. Stop running away from the messes you've made." Matthew nodded, his gaze somber. "I will. I promise." The rest of the day unfolded with a mixture of testimonies and counterarguments, each layer peeling back more of the fractures in Matthew and Julia's marriage. But for Lydia, the pivotal moment came as the proceedings neared their end. Julia stood to make her final statement, her voice trembling but resolute. "I loved him," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. "I gave him everything I had, and it still wasn't enough. But I've realized something, that's not my fault. I deserve someone who chooses me, every day. And if he couldn't do that, then this divorce is the best thing that's ever happened to me." The words struck a chord deep within Lydia. She felt the sting of familiarity, the echo of her own heartbreak mirrored in Julia's pain. And yet, there was something else, something hopeful. A reminder that survival wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. As the gavel fell to mark the end of the day, Lydia sat back in her chair, her thoughts a whirlwind. She had spent years building walls around herself, convinced that moving on meant erasing the past. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to face it instead. The final verdict loomed, but Lydia knew one thing for certain: no matter how this case ended, it would mark a turning point. Not just for Matthew and Julia, but for herself as well. The courtroom was still as Lydia Harper prepared to deliver her final judgment. The weight of the case, and the tangled history it carried, pressed on her like never before. It wasn't just the Langstons' future at stake, it was her own reckoning with the past. Matthew sat at the defense table, his shoulders slouched in quiet resignation. Julia, on the opposite side, exuded quiet strength. Lydia's eyes moved between them, her mind carefully parsing the evidence, the testimonies, and the raw emotions laid bare. "This court has reviewed the facts and testimony," Lydia began, her voice measured, though inside she felt anything but calm. "It is clear that irreconcilable differences have brought this marriage to its conclusion." Her gaze shifted briefly to Julia. "Mrs. Langston, your courage in seeking closure and prioritizing your well-being is commendable. You've shown strength in the face of betrayal, and this court believes you are entitled to equitable relief." She turned to Matthew, whose face remained unreadable. "Mr. Langston, the court acknowledges your acknowledgement of your failures. However, actions have consequences, and it is evident that your choices have caused significant harm." With a final glance at the notes in front of her, Lydia delivered the judgment: the court grants the divorce. In light of the financial and emotional damages sustained by Mrs. Langston, Mr. Langston is ordered to pay spousal support and relinquish any claims to the shared property in question. The gavel struck wood, signaling the end. It was a fair decision, impartial and rooted in justice. Yet as the courtroom emptied, Lydia felt the familiar ache of unresolved emotions. Matthew lingered behind, waiting until the room was empty. Lydia was still at her bench, gathering her papers, when he approached. "Judge Harper," he said, his voice tentative. She didn't look up. "The case is over, Mr. Langston. There's nothing left to discuss." "Maybe not for the court," he replied, "but there's something I need to say to you." She paused, letting out a sharp breath, before meeting his gaze. His eyes held something she hadn't seen before: vulnerability. "I've spent my life running," Matthew began, his voice heavy. "From responsibility, from pain, from myself. I ran from you because I was scared. You deserved someone better, and I didn't know how to be that person." Lydia's throat tightened, but she remained silent. "I know I hurt you," he continued. "And I know I can't undo that. But seeing you here, strong, brilliant, unshaken, it makes me realize how much I lost. You didn't just survive what I did to you, you became more than I ever could have imagined." Lydia finally stood, her heart pounding. "Matthew," she said, her voice firm, "you're right about one thing: I did deserve better. And I found it, in myself. I don't need your apology to heal, and I certainly don't need your validation now." He nodded slowly, a faint, bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. "I just wanted you to know. I'll carry the regret of losing you for the rest of my life." Lydia's expression softened, just a fraction. Then make it mean something. Be better. Not for me, but for yourself. Matthew hesitated, then extended his hand. It was a gesture of truce, a quiet acknowledgement of the bridge that could never be rebuilt but didn't need to burn entirely. She stared at his hand for a moment before shaking it, her touch firm and steady. "Goodbye, Matthew," she said, her tone final. "Goodbye, Lydia," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Later that evening, Lydia sat in her quiet apartment, the events of the day swirling in her mind. She poured herself a glass of wine and stood by the window, staring out at the city lights. For years, she had let the pain of her past shape her. But now, she felt something shift, a lightness she hadn't known she needed. The wounds Matthew left behind hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined her. She thought of Julia, walking out of the courtroom with her head held high. She thought of herself, once a heartbroken bride, now a woman who had found her power and purpose. Lydia raised her glass in a silent toast, to the strength it took to face the past and the courage to embrace the future. As the city hummed below her, Lydia Harper allowed herself to smile. The case was over, but her life was just beginning. If you liked it, subscribe to the channel and enjoy these other amazing stories.